interview was 1 week ago. Then, after that interview, he left for Beijing. Joining us right now to talk more about that is the former press secretary and President Trump, America First Action senior advisor and spokesperson, Sean Spicer. And back with us here in the studio is the author of The Coming Collapse of China, Gordon Chang. Sean, Gordon, great to see you both. Thank you so much for being here, gentlemen. Gordon, let me kick this off with you. Your reaction to Stephen Mnuchin a week ago. Something obviously broke down this past week in Beijing.
Yeah, clearly, and I think reality is just hitting both sides. But, you know, there's been a lot of cheerleading on the part of administration officials, and you can sort of understand why. But there's some things that are really obvious, political considerations, especially in Beijing, but also in Washington, pushing the two sides apart. And part of it is the Chinese economy. You have to understand what's going on there because that really affects their motivation right now.
At the same time, Sean Spicer, you've seen the president do dealings before, and he likes to make threats. Is this a threat that the president is trying to effect change, get the Chinese to the table to agree to what the U.S. wants?
Of course it is, absolutely. I mean, but nothing is closed with the Chinese until it's actually closed. And then you've got to do what Secretary Mnuchin was talking about in terms of the enforcement mechanism. So the devil's going to be in the detail. But for decades, China has been subsidizing its industries. It's been engaging in predatory trade practices, especially with respect to intellectual property and the illegitimate transfer of wealth that has gone on from our human capital to them. So for the president to stand up to them and to make it very clear that we're going to fight, continue to fight, is what I think is important. Too often you've seen these, patty cake type meetings where everybody walks out with agreements about long-term goals and strategies. The president understands that you've got to stop talking, you got to start doing. And so I think being tough right now is what's needed, because until the Chinese come here and figure out how to close that gap, then we don't have a deal.
Sean, Mitch Rochelle, and Gordon, you can potentially weigh on this too. The NAFTA 2.0 USMCA still hasn't been ratified by the House. So obviously, China knows that there's a political risk here, that even if a deal is done, it couldn't be ratified. Are they slow playing, recognizing that there's a sort of political fallout? They don't want to give the win to the Democrats, don't want to give the win to the president. So to you, Sean, is that likely in the mix here in the negotiations, that China just knows that there's a potential win for the president that the House will never let happen?
No, I think because there's a difference in terms of what needs to be ratified. So you can make a trade deal that's outside of or on the periphery as opposed to USMCA, which needs to go through Congress. And that's separate. But I mean, that may have some type of calculus in their thinking, but I think Gordon's right in terms of, I think the Chinese are more concerned with their own economy than they are about our political situation. But both sides right now, as they get close, the political realities creep in terms of what it means for their own constituencies. And how this will be played is what matters. China obviously plays the long game in all these kind of talks. They're not thinking about the next election because they don't have to. And so I think they're thinking of how will this play with their people and how will it affect their economy. And the same thing with us. You've got a lot on the line when it comes to what the president is going to get. With respect to China, though, domestically, if the president got them to bend on whether it was intellectual property or non-tariff and tariff barriers, I think our Congress, regardless of party, would have to applaud the president and approve anything he did. That's a little bit different than Mexico, where we've got the Democrats are always going to have labor and environmental issues that suddenly creep up at the last minute to get a deal over the line.
Sean, it's Daga McDowell, but this is part of President Trump's communications strategy, which, again, you know very well, where he will say something very maybe outrageous, tweet something harsh, but the reality on the ground is a little bit different than the verbiage coming out of the president or the language that he uses. And I point to this on the tariff issue and the fight with China, that the U.S. trade representative might have to give U.S. industry a pretty decent notice on any change in tariffs. So this wouldn't be something that would happen instantaneously, 10% to 25% on $200 billion in goods on Friday. And then also they want to move slowly because they do fear the people who negotiate these trade deals of a legal challenge to what happens.
Well, yeah, but I think that the bigger issue goes back to Maria's first question, which is if you are the Chinese and you're negotiating with this president, unlike previous administrations, regardless of the mechanism and the timing that it'll take to implement it, you know that he means business. That's not what they faced in the past. And I think whether or not it takes 30 or 60 or 90 days to implement what he ultimately decides, if he says we're going to raise the tariff rate up to 25%, you know he's not kidding. Right.
Yeah.
So you may have more time. And I think that's the difference in the negotiating style that brings these guys to the table and could potentially make the difference in whether or not we close the deal or don't.
Gordon, let me play a few, Gordon and Sean, the response from Larry Kudlow. The National Economic Council Director Larry Kudlow responded to the president's ramping up of this fight and the president's tweets yesterday. Here's what he said on Fox yesterday.
The president is, I think, issuing a warning here that, we bent over backwards earlier. We suspended the 25% tariff to 10, and then we've left it there. That may not be forever if the talks don't work out. China has got to end its unfair, non-reciprocal trading system. They're breaking the laws. We hope they'll come around with this deal. But if they don't, the president is saying, guess what? The tariffs will...
Whether there's a deal.
Your reaction?
I think Kudlow has sort of laid down the marker, and clearly here, Dagan, I know you're right that the president sometimes goes overboard on stuff, but this time I think he's actually quite serious because he put a deadline on the increase in tariffs. And also, I think the president's general posture towards China has been disengagement to try to get U.S. companies to move back to the U.S. And this really fits in very well with what the president has been trying to do. And I think that's really the long-term strategy, because in another agreement with China isn't going to solve all of these fundamental problems. Xi Jinping has this notion of a state-dominated economy. He has very little room for foreigners in his conception of China, and we've got to understand that that's his endgame. And so no agreement's going to help us on that regard.
One thing I'll point out, though, is to watch longer-term interest rates, because, again, do investors react, not just this morning, but do investors react with fear about the U.S. economy, or do they start worrying about China buying less of our debt, China even selling our debt, because that would send longer-term interest rates up. That hurts the U.S. economy, given the fact that we're running almost $1 trillion annual budget deficit now.
Let me just say the president is responding and tweeting right now. He just tweeted this on the trade dispute with China. The United States has been losing for many years $600 to $800 billion a year on trade. With China, we lose $500 billion. Sorry, we're not going to be doing that anymore. Gordon.
Yeah,
also,
Maria,
go ahead, Sean.
I think this is important to understand, because just last week you saw Vice President Biden sort of minimize the threat that China poses to us. I think that what people have to understand, China has played the long game for a long time. Gordon just referenced this. They're talking about a strategy of 2050 and beyond of world domination. They want to make sure that they're controlling. You look at the investments they're making in Africa and throughout the globe. This president understands that not just the economic, but the national security threat that China poses, not just to the United States, but to the entire world. And that by standing up to them now, whether it's these unfair trade practices or the threat that a company like Huawei poses to not just our economic, but our national security structure, is critical. And so you can pacify them or pass the buck, as a lot of administrations have done. But I think that we finally have a president that understands the totality of the threat that China poses and is standing up to them in a way that's never been done before.
But it's not a loss. He uses that word all the time. It is not a loss. We give China money and we get things in return. Just like when you walk into a grocery store, it's not a loss if you buy $50 in groceries because you walk out with a bag of goods.
But it is a loss when they steal $300 to $400 billion.
But that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about the trade deficit.
No, but
that's not a loss.
Yeah. I understand what you're saying on trade deficit, but on theft of intellectual property, this is a grievous loss to the United States.
I agree, but that's not what he was tweeting about.
Well, but I do think that he's looking at the China story as a whole set of behaviors coming from China. You're right, in specific numbers, talking about the trade.
He says that a lot, and then because again, it's messaging to the American people. But we get something every time we buy an iPhone. You get something in return for the money that's sent by Apple to China to make that iPhone.
I mean, the trade story to me is secondary to really these other big issues. I mean, the behavior of China stealing from us for decades and forcing the transfer of technology, using all of its billions to acquire Silicon Valley companies in and then just take their technology. Those are the real issues.
Yeah, and also they're using this money for their military, and they're threatening the United States. So we're feeding the threat against us.
Yeah, go ahead, Sean. Final word.
There's no other way to say this than it has been the largest illegitimate transfer of wealth in probably our world's history. I mean, Gordon's right. These guys come in, they grab our companies, they force them through ownership structures to give them access to all of their technology. They steal it, and then they leave us for nothing. I mean, this is a big deal to stand up to them in this way.
Yeah, I agree with you. It is. All right, we will keep watching this. Gordon Chang, we will see you a little later in the program. Sean Spicer, thank you. Mark